Hello, and welcome to EZRA Asks, the show where we sit down with bold thinkers, sharp operators, and thoughtful humans to explore the questions shaping the future of work. My name is Sinead Keenan, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at EZRA, where I head up our labs team. And today our question is, should organisational culture be created by default or by design? Everyone talks about culture, but most leaders don't really design it. Instead, they're inheriting it. And when disruption hits, you find out, is culture an engine or is it indeed an anchor? So today I'm joined by someone who's doing exactly this work at global scale. Raj Verma is the Chief Culture, Inclusion and Experience Officer at Sanofi, one of the world's leading pharma companies. So Raj joined Sanofi in 2020, just as the world was locking down, to lead something that had never really been done before in pharma, weaving together culture and inclusion and employee experience into the core business strategy. He has pioneered programs that show what it looks like when culture becomes a care system and indeed an operating principle. Raj has spent 25 plus years in leading HR roles across Ford, Jaguar Land Rover, Santander, Sodexo. So I think it's fair to say he knows what it takes when it comes to shifting culture in complex, global and indeed regulated environments. And what I really admire about his work is that he doesn't treat culture as soft. It's thinking about it as something really strategic. And his mantra, which is something I've been thinking about a lot, is culture by design, not default. And that's exactly the mindset we need more of. So with that, I am delighted to welcome Raj to the show. Welcome, Raj.
Hi, Sinead.
Great to have you here with us today. So we're going to dive in, and I've heard you say before that your job is to help people unleash the very best of their whole selves to transform the practice of medicine. And that is a big, bold ambition. What drew you to that challenge at Sanofi, especially, as we just said, at a time when the world was in complete upheaval?
Look, I think there's never a better time to join an organisation when the world's changing around you, because that's when you get to really reimagine what the future of work could really look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that in a moment. Before we do that, though, we always have, at the beginning of our podcasts, we always ask our guests, what is your superpower? What is your particular superpower?
I think I'm really good at joining up the dots and seeing the bigger picture. And that gets me through a lot of the non-value add stuff that you can sometimes face when you're in organisations that are going through transformation.
Yeah. And I can see how that would be such an important strength in your particular role. So just to warm us up, right, we're going to do a few rapid fire questions just to get the brain going. Okay, so first question for you. Would you rather live without email or without meetings?
Meetings.
Why is that? You said that so quickly.
Sometimes I think we don't know why we're in a meeting, and there's lots of people in the meeting and you don't know what you're trying to get out of the meeting. So I feel that takes up a lot of energy and time. And although emails can sometimes be short and sharp, you can get a lot of stuff done through there. And we use, Teams at work. We use a lot of instant messaging, WhatsApp, etc., just to get stuff done. I don't always think you need to sit down for 45 minutes to an hour to talk about stuff with lots of people, get the right people in the conversation to get a decision. Yep.
I think I might agree with you on that. Would you rather get stuck in a lift with your younger or older self?
I would say younger.
Why is that?
Only because I could then say it's going to be okay.
Because your younger self was quite concerned about the future, or?
I think my younger self didn't really know.
Yeah.
30 plus years back, when you're leaving university and everything else, it's the brave new world, and you have limited life experience and work experience. So you don't really know. I mean, I think the generation of today are probably a little bit more enlightened. But I went through the traditional routes, not quite knowing where they were necessarily going to take me, but it worked out in the end.
Yeah, well, clearly did. Okay, last one for you.
Okay.
Would you rather design the perfect culture from scratch or inherit a broken one and fix it?
I'm a fixer. So I would always try and fix something. I think it's too easy to throw stuff out. And part of, I think, where I get my energy is bringing people to those conversations to help them co-create what the future could look like. And that makes a big difference when you're transforming organizations, because you want to bring the organization with you.
Yep, absolutely. So, so what we're really talking about here is that culture doesn't just happen. It is intentionally designed, intentionally engineered. And I think, every organization that we're speaking to at the moment, clients that we work with, they're all talking about transformation. But I don't hear culture being discussed in that mix in the same way. And arguably that is the thing that makes any transformation stick. So just, if we can just kind of take a moment to think about, one of your roles, as I understand it, at Sanofi is to treat culture as that kind of strategic engine architecture to support the Take the Lead chapter of Sanofi's next sort of global transformation. What does that really mean for you?
Look, I think part of why it's important to have a culture that is by design, not default, is that I've made it my job to muscle into different conversations that perhaps I wouldn't have been in had I not been intentional about it. So when I first joined Sanofi, one of the opportunities I took was to weave in 3 key areas that I felt were key enablers for any transformation. That was culture, it was inclusion, and it was the employee experience in the workplace. And that trifactor of activity has helped us create a dynamic where we've got people helping us co-create stuff. So one of the things we'd learned through lockdown as to why people were leaving organizations was because the culture that they then found during a period of lockdown, their approach to diversity and inclusion, and the experience that they were feeling every single day. And then there were 3 reasons why people wanted to join different companies. It was because of the culture that they'd heard and seen. It was because of their approach to diversity and inclusion. And it was because of the experience that they were starting to see in different organizations. So for me, that's really important that we took it more as a enabler of helping the transformation work in a way that everything was joined up.
Super interesting, because I think what you're touching on there is culture being key for talent attraction, talent retention, organizational commitment. I think being engaged, and this role, this integrated role, culture, inclusion, and experience. I don't think I've ever come across anybody with such a interesting portfolio combination. But when you were brought in, Raj, to do this role, was there like a commercial problem, imperative that you were really helping to solve? Was it about retention, engagement?
I think one of the big things in pharma is about speed to market, and having a high performing culture really does drive innovation. And at Sanofi, we thrive on R&D, breakthroughs, and making sure we can get to market and do our launches really efficiently, because every extra day that we take to work through the drug is 1 day less that a patient has that drug in their hand. So being a high-performing culture is really, really important. But on top of that, we want to make sure it was inclusive and accessible, because at the end of the day, inclusion expands our market reach. And I think that's really important, because we want our employees who may at some point also be patients or may already be patients. So it's really important that they are part of helping us design and deliver some of the medicines into the hands of patients. And the employee experience, I feel, is that in today's age, it's got to be as good as the experience that you get outside of work, right? You know what it's like when you're opening your new Apple phone. How intuitive and how easy is it to get yourself set up? We want that same experience in the workplace because our employees expect it. This whole notion of personalization is such an important part of the workplace now. So when I started to look at the role, originally I talked about inclusion, culture, but the employee experience in the workplace knits it all together. So all of these 3 things are inextricably linked in terms of helping our transformation stick for the longer term.
Yep. Yeah, and I do really appreciate how you've connected it. Your superpower, connecting the dots, but connecting it to commercial strategy. So it's not this is, as you said, inextricably linked to what we're trying to do for our patients, for our communities, inclusion, thinking about our own employees as indeed patients, potential patients, their family will be patients. So I can really see that this is not lip service. Like we can see this is really driving forward the transformation. That being said, this, and I do love this kind of notion of culture by design, not by default. But where do you start with that? What are the building blocks?
I think the first thing I'd say, you're going to have a culture whether you design it or not. So you may as well have a culture you want versus the one that's just there, because that will enable your business to transform. I think it all starts with having clarity in terms of what it is that you're trying to achieve. What are the machines and the tools and the process and the systems that you need to deliver? And what we did at Sanofi was that we built culture around three key areas. One was around purpose. What was the purpose of Sanofi? And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But anchoring sort of all of our decisions in the why and the shared values, right? Because I think it's really important that we have a culture that reflects that. Systems. Your processes, your policies, your practices, they have to be linked, right? You can't have a culture which says do X and your systems don't allow you to do X. And finally, symbols, and that's when I really talk about the leadership tone, the communication, really walking the talk. That's such an important part of building confidence and trust, that people feel that we're going in the right direction with all the work that we're putting in to ensure that we have a culture that we really, really need to deliver on our purpose.
This last point in particular is fascinating to me, because I think it is so, I suppose, easy for all of us to think, well, if we have a new set of values and we put it on our Zoom background, we have the poster beside the lift in the office buildings and whatnot, that people will just live these values day to day, and that will become our culture, and we'll see that in all of our kind of behavioral DNA, etc. But of course, that's not really the reality. So to get to this point about like symbols and people and leaders walking the talk, I just would love to know more about how have you practically done that? And you must have met some resistance along the way with that.
Look, I think a lot of what we tried to do is to bring people with us. I think we had a very clear vision of where we needed to get to enable our strategy to deliver, and we had to transform along the way. So, for every organization, especially Sanofi, you have to perform and transform at the same time. You don't have a choice. But to enable that, we wanted people to change their ways of working, evolve their ways of working, practice different ways of working. And those ways of working ladder up to our four sets of values. And I think that's really important, that there's transparency as to if you do X, then Y is likely to happen. And most culture change can be anywhere between 3 to 5+ years. Right. So if you want it to stick, you've got to put the tools in place to give people that level of confidence that they need to practice those ways of working. And that's exactly what we did. We really spelt it out super clearly in terms of there are a bunch of tools, and maybe I can share some of those as we chat through. But, where do you see yourself at the moment? What do we now need to do to help you and bring you along the journey with us? And I think that's really important, that we want every single person in Sanofi to see themselves in the future of Sanofi.
Yeah.
And we will do everything we can to help bring people together on that front. So we're very intentional about the tools that we're putting in place, because they're evergreen and they're constantly available, and we start to work through our people with those tools. And recognition is a big part of that. So we're rewarding people who are demonstrating those ways of working in a really positive stance, but also sharing some of the failures, because failure is where we learn the most.
Yeah. And I think, you're absolutely right that how you embed and sustain culture is that how you encourage and reward and incentivize, of course, those right behaviors that you're trying to embed, such that they become, your daily interactions. But just reflecting on that, I suppose because I'm also thinking about part of your role, of course, is inclusion and building belonging. And I could imagine that, with belonging being such a deeply personal experience, and then you're trying to, at the same time, scale culture in a global, complex organization, there's got to be like a bit of a tension or a paradox that you hit there with that. How do you kind of tackle some of that?
One of the interesting things when I launched, so we're now in our second chapter of our inclusion strategy, which is called Belong Beyond Boundaries. Our first chapter was about creating our diversity edge. And I was being interviewed by a journalist, and they said, look, this is the first global inclusion strategy that Sanofi have put in place, and it sounds really ambitious. How many people have you got in your team? And I said, I've got 100,000 people in my team, because every single person at Sanofi has their own diverse background and context, and my job is to bring the best out of them into the workplace. So part of our storytelling around why we're doing what we're doing was to make sure that everybody could see themselves in the change. The second piece is, you were always going to have pockets of resistance, and the way that I built that through was through conversation, and to demonstrate the value that can be created by being far more inclusive and having a diverse group of people to reflect the different demographics of the patient population in various countries that we're trying to serve, so we understand them better. And I think part of what we've tried to do is to really evolve the work we're doing through our patients, through our people, and the places in which we live and work. So with chapter 2, we've really integrated it as part of systemic change. Chapter 1 was really building the foundation. We delivered on 9 KPIs a year early because people were really interested, because they could see themselves in some of these changes. Now, chapter 2 is it's a lot more subtle and a lot harder to do because, as you said earlier, belonging is very personal to someone. We want you to feel that you belong in Sanofi so you can give your very best, because we want to be a high-performing organization throughout. So what can we do? And this is where a lot of the work we do around accessibility comes in. Do you have all the tools that you need to be able to perform really, really well? And that becomes an intrinsic part of the investments that we make in digital tools as well as physical support tools that people can use.
Yeah, and that idea that your team is 100,000 people, I think that really resonates for me. That's how we should think about it, right? Everybody is part of this. Everybody has a sort of a role and responsibility to play in kind of creating that sense of belonging and inclusion. But just thinking then about, from what I understand, your global inclusion board has leaders, external advisors, you have ERG groups, representatives, and a lot of organizations will be looking to kind of model, I think, a similar approach. And again, they're thinking with an eye to sort of their external market as well. Like, you've probably learned a lot, probably have some good war stories. What's a piece of advice that you might share with people on that journey?
The first thing I did was to make sure I've got that commitment from the top.
Right.
That leadership tone is so important. Otherwise, you can have as many boards and councils as you want, but if they're not done for the right reasons, you're wasting your time, in all frankness. Our CEO was super committed, when we launched our first chapter, and I remember the conversation with him is that, I need all of your XCOM, all of your direct reports to have skin in the game. So half of the XCOM now sit on our inclusion board, and the other half are XCOM sponsors of one of our employee business resource groups. So every single person on that executive team have a vested interest in the work we're doing. And the other piece I did, we got everybody some coaching to help them start to think about their story, because the work of inclusion is personal. And every single person had a different and unique story about why it would be important for them, whether that's through social mobility or whether that's through ethnicity, religion, or whatever the difference may be for them. Because this isn't about giving people, here's a standard script. It's about helping them write their own. And that is what makes it genuine. So I think the first thing you need to do if you want to set up an inclusion board is to get your CEO totally onboarded and to be the face of that. Our CEO chairs our inclusion board, and in over 3.5 years now, he's never missed a single meeting. To get
That's
that
incredible.
level of commitment, and he's totally energized by the conversations we have. And I think that makes a huge difference. And by his own admission, he's learning as he's going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he always used this phrase of, we're all a work in progress. And I think that level of humility helps us to be better, to be best in class, to really strive for boldness when we're trying to look at different ways of doing things. I think the other piece around the inclusion board is to be very clear on outcomes and expectations. What is it that we're trying to achieve? What will the board do to enable our strategy to get delivered? Where do we need their help and influence? Where do we need their voice to really go back into their own businesses to do that? Having external advisors was really important because I didn't want to mark my own homework, right? I wanted to make sure that we were challenged, we were bringing the outside in, we were trying to take a full 360 view about what it is that we should be doing. And, all this is linked into the strategic direction of the organization. When you're dealing with patients around the world, they are all going to be different. So we have to make the effort and be intentional about understanding that difference. And a lot of it is about changing the mechanics of your organization so that you are identifying bias, you are looking at where there's unintended consequence, you are ensuring that you've got the very best talent, and you're not looking in the same place that you've always looked. So that was, I'd say, with the inclusion board, quite a key part of ensuring that everybody was aligned. We also had representation from our employee business resource groups, so that they had a voice to the table. And we also had an early talent, because we looked around and thought, gosh, we're all the other end. Where's the future of the next generation? So we intentionally went out and identified somebody from the US who's now been part of our board for 3 years to bring in a different generational perspective about what we should be thinking about doing in the future. The other bit I would say is we've invested a lot in employee business resource groups. We have 5 of those, and they are really our internal consultants. So we leverage them when we have, or when we want a perspective or some insight or advice on either product naming or on whether we turn up to certain events to help us with talent attraction or candidate engagement, and they're organized, they're structured. We have a playbook, they have goals. So it's professionalized, right? It's not about food, fun, and flags, right? This is much more integrated. I'm not saying we don't do the other stuff. It's that there's a commercial reason why we have invested the way that we have to really help them feel part of the changes that we're trying to make.
Yeah.
And then in the middle, we have a small center of expertise, my team, which help bring everything together, because you need that level of insight and perspective and experience. And that then completes the circle. So you've got the board at the top, you've got the EBRGs at grassroots, and you've got a very small center of expertise to bring it all together.
So it's so interesting. And I think, what strikes me here is, in particular, the point about the employee business resource groups. I'm not sure I've often heard of them being so involved in product strategy and thinking about the communities that are being served and how they may represent those communities, and effectively, as you said, being your internal consultants or focus groups, which is such a meaningful role, right? In addition to everything else that's important internally, but I really like how that bridges then to your external community as well.
Look, it's really important that, we want people to really fight for these leadership roles as a global EBRG leader, because they also help with talent, with their careers. It also helps bring them into, I think, key parts of the changes we're trying to make, because it's easy to overlook stuff, right? And maybe I can share an example with you that, in the UK, we were launching a drug for erectile dysfunction, and we called it Cialis for Men. And one of the questions we had for each other was, seems like we might be missing an opportunity. Let's just test it with our LGBT community. And with the resource groups in the UK, they said, well, what about transgender? What about women? And based on that, it's now called Cialis Together.
Right.
which has suddenly opened up a market that perhaps may have been alienated had it just been careless for men. And that's with the lived experiences, the insights, the perspective from our resource groups to help us shape that. So I use that as a case study because it shows the power of reaching out to employees that previously you may not have done. But you've got to have it structured, you've got to have it organized, you've got to know how to ensure that they've got a voice and you're reaching out, not just if there's a crisis, but right at the start of when you're thinking or designing something. That's a key stakeholder group.
Yeah. And I was just thinking then about this, I suppose, bridging then to, almost from the notion that culture is often perceived as it can be perceived as soft, and executives can see it that way. And here what we're starting to talk about is how it actually drives commercial results. And clearly, just you mentioned there, you have a CEO who has been at every, hasn't missed a single meeting. You have executive committee leaders who are very invested. How have you really managed to gain that kind of commitment and sponsorship that they see this as such an imperative?
I think one of the things I've been able to bring to the conversation is that I'm not a specialist. I'm not an expert. I don't think there are any experts, by the way, in the work of inclusion, for example. I would see myself as a transformer. I've been working in generalist HR, in and out of centre of expertise roles, shared services, business partnering. So what I always start with is the so what. And my team will tell you that there's only two questions I ever ask: why and so what. Because I think it's really important we can see the investment in the work that we're doing, what's the impact for our patient ultimately, and therefore how do we help our people make that impact. So I will always take and start with the commercial position, and I think that helps with the credibility of the conversation with your leaders, that we're doing this to ultimately help them and help the business grow or maintain or change. So I always start with that premise that I should not be doing anything that A is a surprise and B is not helping the business achieve some of its goals.
And I know we've spoken before, Raj, about how when you're thinking about your moments that matter in the organization and how you kind of, again, architect and design those, you've mentioned that you have 7, I think, employee life cycle touch points. What are some of the kind of cultural elements that are non-negotiable for you in each of those? Well, not each of those, but even just to give us a couple of examples.
Yeah, look, I think we have a model called the 765 model in Sanofi, and we built it around the employee experience. So we have 7 employee life cycles, 6 dimensions through which we look at each life cycle point, and 5 activation points to get stuff done. So, it's everything from discovering Sanofi. So even before you apply for a job, what's the employer brand saying to you? Is it aligned with what you're seeing on our websites, what you're hearing on Glassdoor, what you're seeing in different social media bits? Because it has to reflect the reality, right? And I think, a long time ago when I was in resourcing, somebody had said to me, try not to sell people the dream for them to live the nightmare, right? And I've never forgotten that, because I think it's so important that we reflect the reality of what our organization is all about. So discovering Sanofi, has to really appeal to the purpose of you, and does it connect with the purpose of the organization? Joining Sanofi, so the moment that you step into Sanofi, what does that feel like? Was it as you expected it from the moment you were being interviewed? Are we using more digital technology to help you embed, get you onboarded so you can hit the ground faster? How do we make sure that we continue to engage you and help you feel you belong? So all the tools, processes and systems, are they all linked? Because what you can't do is have contradictory systems in place that don't reflect the values of the organization and what it is that you're trying to achieve. So they're just some examples, but what we've tried to do is to make sure the tone of voice, building out the experiences is really about ensuring all of our global processes also align. And that's heavy work, that's hard work, and that's constantly evolving. because the technology is evolving, expectations are evolving, so you've always got to be on top of that. But we do take a full 360 view. So all of our 7 employee life cycles, there are a number of moments that matter that sit underneath them. So in total, we have 32 moments that matter. And each of those are a specific process. And all of those processes go through a 765 lens to make sure they are as personalized and focused on the employee right from the start. So that centricity around the need of our employees is where we always start from.
So an employee lifecycle moment might be pre-boarding, onboarding.
Yep.
Right.
So discovering Sanofi, which is the very first, it's the moment you see an advert or you see some sort of job that on a board that takes you to the website that gives you a reality of what Sanofi is like. The joining Sanofi is, okay, you've been pre-boarded. Now, day one. So we have an app in Sanofi that after you've signed your contract, 30 days before you start, an app will drop into your inbox and it will walk you through every single day, little modules. So the day you join, you're 30 days in already. It talks about the strategy, the values. It gives you insight into the organization, meeting some of the executive team, looking at some of our products, our medicines, our vaccines, what's happening in the industry, so that everybody who joins has had that same consistent experience of coming into Sanofi.
Yeah.
And then once you're in, you've got your buddy. And then you stay on this platform for another 30 days as you start to really get into the Sanofi culture, and you start to see how we do things, the ways of working and the tools and the learning that's associated with that. So there's a whole plan that goes with it, and it's joined up so that the experience is consistent, you know, and previously everybody was doing inductions in person at different countries, different roles that were inconsistent. So when we put the business case together for having a global app, and everything we try and do is as globalized as it possibly can be to reduce the complexity, to increase simplification and that one Sanofi experience. It's really important.
Yeah. And I think that's just a lovely, tangible example of how you're, and again, I'm thinking about people tuning into this. So identifying what are employee lifecycle touch points, what are the key moments within that, how do we ensure that that represents a culture, our purpose in a consistent way. And it's what I think what's really nice about that is it's getting into that very granular level, but those are the little things, right, that actually the kind of combined effect is what you feel and the experience that you have.
You know, we want people to share their experiences, good, bad, or indifferent, because I think that's how we learn. And this is why things around accessibility are so important. You know, so one of the big things that we've done this year is launch accessibility lounges and accessibility pop-ups, so that if you need digital support around software because you may have dyslexia or you may have challenges you know, through audio or through the mouse that you use or the ergonomics of the seat that you use. So now we have lounges where you can experience some of this. We also have pop-ups so that every site has a pop-up where you can go and test some of this stuff. But sometimes you don't know what you don't know. How do you know you need some of this technology if you've never really experienced it or seen what's available? So we've really democratized your access to some of the tools. And you can just go and automatically order the software that you need. You don't have to ask your manager's permission. Right? So that makes it easier for you to be able to perform way better because we're now making sure that you've got access to the tools that you need. And I think that's just a symbol of our commitment to ensure that, you know, being able to be your very best at Sanofi, we're going to make it as easy as possible as we can for you.
I think just to sort of taking a step back and reflecting on, again, I'm just so interested in some of the work that you were doing with communities and underserved communities. I was really interested to hear about that initiative that you've launched on 1 Million Conversations, which is all about building trust between healthcare and, again, these sort of underserved communities. Maybe you can just tell me a little bit more about that, because it sounds very big and bold.
So we started this over 4 years ago and was really looking at where is there a space in the pharma world that nobody's really looking at. And we had a number of different opportunities and options that we saw. And one of the big areas was around this notion of trust. Although organizations talk about trust, no one's really double clicking to say, well, why and how and what, and therefore, so what? So we decided with the executive team, so it wasn't something that we got a consultant to say, here's the answer. We wanted to be a real part of Sanofi's conversation. So storytelling is really important when you're going through change. And I wanted to be able to share how we got from an idea to how we managed to launch and land. So we know that there are many communities that are disadvantaged in healthcare because there's a lack of trust between what they see, from accessibility to medicines. And we saw that through COVID and how many different communities, especially in the US, were not willing to take the vaccine. So what could we have done and what did we do to help bridge some of those gaps? So we had a program in the US, for example, called Trusted Messenger, where we went to the Black Afro-Caribbean communities and shared some of the insights and perspectives to help them better understand how the vaccine could help. So I think what we wanted to do was we wanted to be able to focus on every patient, not just some. And I think through 1 Million Conversations, that's been our vehicle for really building a theory of change around trust in healthcare. So we launched it in Davos in 2022. So our CEO launched that with a commitment of 50 million euros to really increase the leadership from different communities in healthcare, to create dialogues, both internal and external, around trust or lack of trust, and to help influence the system through white papers, proposals, recommendations to governments or health bodies in different markets. So those 3 buckets, I would say, were really around the theory of change. If we have more people coming into the sector from different backgrounds, so we had scholarships and internships in place, we have more conversation that's transparent, and we use some of that insight to help shape ways of influencing local government, that would help us bridge some of that gap. And it's really important that, when people look at the work that we're doing, they feel that actually, yeah, I understand why you're trying to do it. And we've got some fabulous scholars, many that are now Sanofians who have joined, and they bring their lived experience with them. And I think part of what we're trying to do is to bring that generational input and that early talent with a slightly different lens on healthcare. And that then ripples all the way to the top. So you start to see different representation in different countries from people who've had very different experiences of healthcare. And they themselves may be medics or researchers or in digital or whatever. But the whole point was around representation within Sanofi to reflect the society that we're trying to serve. So that was the frame of 1 Million Conversations. And I think one of the big pieces for us was really to treat it as a business imperative. And I know that sounds a bit cliched, but we wanted every leader to be able to speak about it, to see how the part they played helped to enable it. So we made sure that there was investment, there were measures in place, we had resources, we had readouts of the success and the learnings that we put in place. And, it is a proper transformation effort. It's not a project on the sideline. It's something that our global CEO has endorsed and sponsored from day one, and he's been part of the leadership shaping it. So I have a view that when you start to do projects that are on the side, that's where they'll always be. You have to bring them into the mix.
Yeah.
And part of what I do and my team do is to muscle ourselves into conversations to make sure that we do bring up things like 1 Million Conversations into the vernacular. So it's just normalized language. It's just who we are. It's what we do. And our purpose is quite clear about chasing the miracles of science. So we call it now about chasing the miracles of science so you can chase your dreams. That's really important, that we want to help you to get the best out of you, and having programs like this really help us to do that.
It's such a kind of inspiring message, that chasing the miracles of science so you can chase your dreams, really connecting organizational purpose, which sometimes can feel quite lofty, but also to what that means for you individually. I suppose, though, how do you make that, I know you've said, and I think you're absolutely right, that culture is more of an art than a science. With that, really interesting idea of helping you to chase your dreams, how do you make that tangible for everyone? You're leading a huge organization, and not everybody is going to be patient facing, right?
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things that we tried to do is that culture, you both see it and feel it. So the easiest way to feel whether your culture is shifting is through engagement surveys. The hardest thing is, where do you see it? Where are the performance indicators shifting? So this was a challenge that my CEO had said, I feel it, but I'm not seeing enough of it. So we created, with the XCOM executive group, and we tested it. We built some culture impact measures that aligned with our values. So, for example, one of our key values is about leading together. And the measure that we had was around percentage of our preferred suppliers that are used in procurement. So if we're leading together, then we should be closer to 90+% of compliance to using our PSL, right? Because it's not just about working with who we like working with, but it's where we've got the agreements, the commercial contracts, etc. So the more we practice that behavior and value and ways of working, the closer we should be getting to a 90% plus compliance to procurement. Another example is about aiming higher. So in Sanofi, we have this app called Play. So AI is a big part of our transformation, and we have 3 buckets of AI. We have expert AI, we have generative AI, and we have snackable AI. Snackable AI is through an app called Play, where in real time, any manager can look at information, data, insight, on any of our medicines, on our supply chain, on our budgets, on engagement, and make decisions. And if we're aiming higher, we should have a far greater usage of that app as the months go on, because we're bringing people to events to help them see what the app can do, to help them use it every single day, and to really push themselves from Excel to AI. And again, that will then shift to the right-hand side of the scale, so it becomes best in class. I mean, they're just 2 examples, but they're linked to each of our 4 values and to business performance indicators. So when I talk about culture impact, it's feel and see.
And again, I think what you're showing in a really concrete way is you can have at that sort of highest level a value. What's it? Leading together, was that right?
Lead together is one of our values.
Lead together, and then how you thread that through to something as really crunchy, practical as procurement, how we engage with suppliers, and being able to then codify, measure that, see impact over time.
And I think that's the difference between having a soft measure and a commercial one. And I think that's where you're more likely to get that level of engagement and commitment from your business, because they can see that if we did practice some of these ways of working, look at what is happening to the way that we work. And I think that's an important part of our transformation.
Again, I'm thinking about our audience, who are often doing exactly this. They are, similar to you, leading transformation, culture in some way. They're thinking about what's going to appeal to my CEO, my CFO, what are the things that they're going to sign off on. So just as we kind of round out our conversation today, Raj, I just love to know, what is one piece of advice that you would give to a leader transforming culture right now?
I would say that you want to start with yourself. I think it's easy to look at everyone else and what they need to do, but what do you need to do as a leader who is part of that change? because that tone is what sets the progress for everyone else. So the only person that you can really change is yourself. So start with yourself.
Start with yourself. Good advice indeed. Another question maybe for you then. What maybe habits or mindset shift would you wish that organizations would adopt?
I'd say, look, design for belonging for your consumers, the patients or customers, for your teams, so the people in your organization, and the places that you live and work, because you also have a societal impact. You know, so if you can look at those three things, that can make a huge difference in terms of the change that you want to impact internally and externally.
So, Raj, another question that I'd love your advice on. One habit or mindset shift that you wish every organization would adopt tomorrow, maybe even today.
I think be obsessed with the employee experience, because that is your biggest lever to your customers, your patients, to your consumers. Get that bit right and everything else will fall in place.
And so last question for you. What is one thing that thriving organizations are doing that other organizations might be missing?
I'd say they're obsessing about the employee experience, because that's the gateway to your customers, your consumers, and your patients.
Absolutely. Raj, thank you so much for being here with us today. I've
My
really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you again for all of your insights. And I think just in summary, you know, what I'm taking away from this conversation with Raj today is that culture isn't something that happens to you. It's something that you engineer. And when you engineer it intentionally, when you make it commercial, you build capability, you connect it to purpose, it stops being that, as Raj said, that initiative on the side, and it starts becoming your competitive advantage. Well, that's it from EZRA Asks today. We hope to see you next time. Bye for now.